Surviving in the Arctic? Most of us can barely handle a broken heater, but the Inuit? They mastered minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures without Netflix, DoorDash, or even a basic thermostat. And their survival tricks are so clever, they make modern camping gear look like toys. Let's dive into their first genius move, staying warm without fire. Ever cranked up your thermostat and still felt cold? Try surviving at negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit with nothing but your wits and what nature provides. I once thought I was tough camping in 30-degree Fahrenheit weather until I learned about how the Inuit handled temperatures that would make a polar bear shiver. Here's the thing about staying warm that most people get completely wrong. It's not about having the biggest fire or the thickest jacket. The Inuit figured out something that took modern science decades to confirm. Your worst enemy isn't the cold itself, it's your own sweat. You heard that right. Sweating in extreme cold is basically asking for a frozen death certificate. Let me share a fascinating bit of Inuit wisdom that blew my mind. They developed a layering system so effective that modern Arctic gear still can't fully replicate it. Instead of one thick layer, they used multiple thin ones, creating tiny air pockets that worked like natural insulation. Think of those expensive jackets at REI. The Inuit had that technology figured out centuries ago, just with different materials. The inner layer, usually made from caribou fur, was worn with the fur facing inward. Why? Because caribou fur is hollow, creating tiny air pockets that trap heat. The outer layer had the fur facing outward, which helped shed snow and prevent ice from forming on their clothing. Pretty clever for people who didn't have access to Gore-Tex, right? One of the most incredible techniques they developed was the art of pre-warming. Here's a stat. Using heated rocks wrapped in furs as natural heating pads, they could maintain comfortable sleeping temperatures even when it was minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit outside. That's colder than the average temperature on Mars. These rocks would stay warm for hours, turning what could have been a freezing night into something almost cozy. They also had this brilliant community approach to survival. When temperatures plummeted to their lowest, families would often sleep together using their combined body heat to stay warm. It wasn't just about survival, it was about understanding that in extreme conditions, community meant everything. But it's impressive how they did all this without developing the tough guy mentality that gets so many modern outdoor enthusiasts in trouble. Instead of trying to power through the cold, they worked with it. They understood that staying warm wasn't about being macho, it was about being smart. Let me tell you about this one time I tried to apply their no sweating principle during a winter hike. I was climbing a steep hill, starting to overheat, and remembered the Inuit wisdom. Instead of pushing through like I usually would, I stopped, took off a layer, and continued at a slower pace. My hiking buddies thought I was being lazy until they had to stop later to change their sweaty base layers while I stayed perfectly dry and warm. This brings us to one of their most practical innovations, the art of ventilation. Ever noticed how expensive winter jackets have all those zippers under the arms and on the sides? Well, the Inuit did it first. They designed their clothing with adjustable openings that could be opened or closed to regulate temperature. Getting too warm? Open a few strategic vents, starting to cool down, close them up. It's like having a natural thermostat built into your clothing. You know what's really interesting about all this? While we're all rushing to buy the latest winter gear with fancy temperature ratings and high-tech materials, the Inuit had already solved these problems centuries ago using nothing but careful observation and natural materials. Modern Arctic explorers often struggled with hypothermia even with their fancy gear, while the Inuit thrived using these time-tested methods. We spend hundreds of dollars on those moisture-wicking base layers, while the Inuit achieved the same thing with carefully prepared animal skins. Imagine walking into REI and asking for their finest caribou fur undershirt. The looks you'd get would be priceless, but staying warm wasn't just about the clothes, it was about movement too. The Inuit knew exactly how to pace themselves to prevent sweating. They moved steadily and purposefully, like they were taking a stroll rather than running a marathon. This meant they could travel long distances without getting wet from sweat, which would have been deadly in such cold temperatures. Now, speaking of keeping things dry, you won't believe what they use to make their boots completely waterproof. Ever heard of seal fat? Well, that's a whole other story that'll change how you think about waterproofing forever. You know those $300 waterproof hiking boots you just bought? The ones that leaked after 2 months? Well, the Inuit would probably find that hilarious. considering they mastered waterproofing was something you can get for free if you happen to have a seal handy, that is. Seal fat, or what scientists call blubber, was basically the Inuit equivalent of WD-40, duct tape, and Gorilla Glue combined. While we're out here spraying our boots with chemicals that barely last a season, the Inuit developed a waterproofing technique that could keep their feet dry in Arctic waters that would freeze most people's toes off in minutes. But the cool thing about seal fat that most people don't know, it's not just some random grease. Seal blubber has special properties that make it perfect for Arctic survival. The fat molecules are structured in a way that creates an incredibly effective water barrier. And unlike modern waterproofing sprays, it actually gets more effective the colder it gets. The fat hardens slightly in extreme cold, creating an even better seal. Let me tell you about my first attempt at using animal fat for waterproofing. I tried using beef tallow on my boots during a camping trip. Let's just say it didn't go as planned. Not only did it smell like I was wearing a hamburger on each foot, but it attracted every curious dog within a mile radius. The Inuit specifically used seal fat because it had properties that other animal fats just couldn't match. But it gets interesting when seal fat wasn't just for waterproofing. It was the Swiss Army knife of survival tools. They used it for cooking, and it's packed with calories and essential nutrients. Lighting seal oil lamps could burn for hours, and even preventing frostbite by creating a protective layer on exposed skin. Talk about getting your money's worth. Did you know that seal fat contains omega-3 fatty acids in concentrations up to 30 times higher than what you'll find in most fish oil supplements? When the Inuit used seal fat, they weren't just waterproofing their gear, they were literally covering themselves in one of the most nutritionally rich substances in the Arctic. If they got stranded and ran out of food, they could actually eat their waterproofing. The process of preparing seal fat was fascinating too. They wouldn't just slap raw blubber on their boots. That would be like trying to waterproof your shoes with butter. Instead, they developed a complex rendering process that turned the raw fat into a stable, long-lasting protective coating. They'd carefully heat the fat to remove impurities and create a substance that was perfect for their needs. This might sound gross to our modern sensibilities, but consider this. While we're filling landfills with worn-out waterproof gear that's lost its effectiveness, the Inuit method was completely sustainable. The seal fat could be reapplied as needed, didn't harm the environment, and utilized every part of an animal they were already hunting for food. It's like the original eco-friendly waterproofing solution. The amusing part is that modern scientists have actually studied seal fat to develop better waterproofing technologies. That's right, some of our most advanced water-resistant materials were inspired by what the Inuit figured out generations ago. Some high-end winter gear manufacturers have even tried to replicate the molecular structure of seal fat in their synthetic materials. One of my favorite facts about seal fat is how it helped solve multiple problems at once. When used on boots, it would gradually warm up from body heat during the day, making it more flexible for walking. Then, as temperatures dropped at night, it would harden slightly, creating an even better water barrier when it was needed most. Try getting your Gore-Tex to do that. The Inuit didn't just use seal fat for footwear, they used it on their clothing seams too. A well-oiled seam could stay waterproof for months, even in the harshest conditions. And unlike modern waterproofing treatments that can lose effectiveness after repeated exposure to salt water, seal fat actually worked better with exposure to sea spray. Today, we have entire stores dedicated to outdoor gear maintenance, special soaps, waterproofing sprays, leather conditioners, and whatnot. The Inuit managed all of that with just seal fat. One substance did the job of an entire REI maintenance section. Talk about efficiency. But perhaps the most impressive thing about seal fat was its role in survival. In temperatures where modern synthetic materials become brittle and crack, seal fat-treated gear remains flexible and functional. It's no exaggeration to say that this simple substance helped make survival possible in one of the world's harshest environments. Speaking of survival in harsh conditions, you won't believe what the Inuit did when food got scarce. Ever heard of aged walrus meat? Trust me, it's a story that'll make your last questionable leftover meal seem fresh as morning dew. And most of us may freak out if we find week-old leftovers in the fridge. Meanwhile, the Inuit were over here turning expired meat into a delicacy that could keep them alive through the darkest Arctic winters. And no, I'm not talking about that sketchy gas station hot dog you ate at 3 a.m. The Inuit practice of fermenting meat, especially the famous Igloo, is probably one of the most misunderstood survival techniques ever. While modern food safety guidelines would have a heart attack just hearing about it, this method kept entire communities alive for generations. The secret? It wasn't actually rotting. It was fermenting, just like that fancy kimchi you paid $15 for at Whole Foods. And the process is wild because they'd wrap walrus or seal meat in seal skin and blubber, bury it in the permafrost, and let it age for months. The meat would undergo controlled fermentation, developing a taste that some people describe as intense cheese meets anchovy meets that thing you found at the back of your freezer. But it was packed with nutrients that were nearly impossible to get any other way during the Arctic winter. Did you know that fermented meat can have up to 400% more vitamin C than fresh meat? That's right. While European explorers were dying of scurvy, the Inuit had basically invented meat-based orange juice. Modern scientists tested some traditionally fermented Inuit foods and found they were absolutely loaded with nutrients that normally break down in regular meat storage. There's this great story about a European explorer who turned his nose up at fermented seal meat, choosing to eat his canned provisions instead. 3 months later, he was begging the Inuit for their rotten meat because his gums were bleeding from scurvy. Talk about eating your words and fermented seal. The really amazing part is how precise this process had to be. Too much fermentation, you've got actual rotten meat. Not enough? You're missing out on the nutritional benefits. The Inuit developed this incredibly sophisticated understanding of fermentation without any of the fancy equipment we use today to measure bacterial growth or pH levels. Modern food scientists have actually studied these techniques and found something amazing. The fermentation process creates natural antibiotics that help preserve the meat. It's like the Inuit invented their own natural preservative system thousands of years before we figured out how to make hot dogs last for suspicious amounts of time. The temperature control was crucial too. Bury the meat too deep in the permafrost, it freezes solid and doesn't ferment. Too shallow, it gets too warm and spoils. They had to find exactly the right depth where the temperature stayed between 35 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Basically, they turned the Arctic ground into a perfect natural refrigerator. You want to hear something interesting? When they tested traditionally fermented Inuit meats in a lab, they found that the bacterial cultures were so perfectly balanced that they actually killed off harmful bacteria. These guys were food safety experts before anyone even knew what bacteria were. It's like they had a PhD in microbiology without ever looking through a microscope. The preservation technique wasn't just about the meat itself, it was about survival. During the long Arctic winters, when hunting was difficult or impossible, these fermented foods became the difference between life and death. A properly fermented cache of meat could keep a family fed for months. The whole process was also incredibly sustainable. Nothing went to waste. Even the seal skin used for wrapping would eventually be used for something else. Compare that to our modern food system, where we throw away about 40% of what we produce. The Inuit would probably think we're the crazy ones. There's this funny story about a 1920s anthropologist who tried to recreate Igloo in his basement in Boston. Let's just say his neighbors called the health department and he had to move to a different neighborhood. Turns out you need more than a DIY spirit to master thousand-year-old preservation techniques. But some Arctic communities still make these fermented foods today, passing down the exact same techniques their ancestors used. While we're all arguing about whether our lunch meat is still good 3 days after opening, they're out here turning expired meat into survival superfoods. And you know what makes this even more impressive? They had to find all these food caches again after storing them. Try finding a specific spot in a vast white landscape where you buried your food months ago. Makes finding your car in a parking lot seem pretty easy, right? Speaking of finding your way around in the Arctic wilderness, how exactly did they navigate through all that endless white? Well, you'd be surprised to learn that they didn't need a GPS, compass, or even a map. The Inuit would find it pretty amusing that we can't find our way to the grocery store without GPS, considering they navigated across vast frozen landscapes using nothing but snow, stars, and some really clever tricks. The first time I heard about Inuit navigation techniques, I was blown away. While modern survival experts rely on expensive gear and satellite technology, the Inuit developed a system so precise They could travel hundreds of miles and return to exactly the same spot months later. And they did it all without a single battery-powered device. Take the wind, for example. The Inuit could read wind patterns like we read road signs. They knew that prevailing winds in their territory consistently sculpted the snow into ripple patterns called sastrugi. These ridges always formed in the same direction, creating a natural compass that worked even during the dark Arctic winter. Pretty handy when you can't see the sun for months at a time. But it's really cool how they used snow itself as a navigation tool. Different types of snow told different stories. Soft snow meant one thing, hard-packed another. They could tell if they were near the coast just by the size and shape of snow crystals. It's like they had Google Maps made entirely of frozen water. The stars played a huge role too, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of just following the North Star like most navigators, the Inuit tracked star patterns through the seasons. They knew exactly how the constellations would appear at different times of year, in different locations. Makes your stargazing app seem a bit basic, doesn't it? Let me give you some stat. Studies have shown that experienced Inuit navigators could maintain accuracy within a few miles, even on journeys over 100 miles long, in complete whiteout conditions. Try doing that with your smartphone when the battery dies. Then, there were the Inuksut, those human-shaped stone markers you might have seen pictures of, but they weren't just random rock piles. Each Inuksuk was carefully designed to communicate specific information. Some marked good hunting spots, others warned of dangerous areas, and some even indicated the direction of the nearest settlement. It was like an ancient Arctic version of road signs, except these lasted for generations. The impressive thing about Inuksut is how much information they could convey. The shape, size, and arrangement of the stones could tell you things like how deep the snow typically got in that area, which direction the dangerous winds came from, or where to find shelter. Some even marked seasonal hunting grounds, basically prehistoric GPS waypoints. But do you know what makes me laugh? Today we panic if our navigation app takes us on a weird route, but the Inuit had backup systems for their backup systems. If the stars were covered, they had the wind patterns. If the wind died down, they had the snow formations. If the snow was too rough to read, they had the Inuksut. They never relied on just one method. There's this great story about an Inuit elder who got asked by a scientist how he navigates in whiteout conditions. His response? "I won't get lost. The land is always there." While we're out here updating our navigation apps, they had the entire landscape memorized. Every ridge, every valley, every typical snow formation. But you'll be amazed how they passed this knowledge down through generations without writing anything down. Just pure observation and memory, shared through stories and experience. They could describe a route so accurately that someone who'd never taken it before could follow it perfectly, hundreds of miles across featureless snow. Maybe the most remarkable thing was their understanding of how navigation changed with the seasons. A route that was perfect in winter might be completely impassable in summer. They memorized multiple versions of each journey, adapting their path based on the time of year. Modern GPS just reroutes you around traffic. These guys rerouted around seasonal changes in the entire landscape. And get this, they even used sound for navigation. In low visibility, they learned to recognize the different sounds that wind makes when it hits different types of snow and ice. They could tell if they were near open water just by the way the air moved. It's like having surround sound navigation. The whole system was so effective that when early Arctic explorers finally started succeeding in their expeditions, it was usually because they'd swallowed their pride and started learning from Inuit guides. Those fancy compasses and sextants weren't much help when everything looked white in every direction. Even more impressive was their ability to navigate during the polar night, when the sun doesn't rise for months. While most of us get disoriented after a few hours without sunlight, they developed ways to read the smallest hints of light on the horizon, the patterns of the stars, and even the behavior of animals to maintain their direction. It's like having night vision goggles built into your brain. But even perfect navigation skills won't help much if you take an unexpected swim in the Arctic Ocean. And trust me, that's a whole other level of survival expertise. When you fall into freezing water, you don't instantly turn into a human popsicle. The Inuit knew this long before scientists started studying cold water survival, and they had some pretty amazing tricks for staying alive when taking an unexpected Arctic swim. Let's talk numbers for a second. Most people think you've got about 2 to 3 minutes in freezing water before you're done for. The Inuit? They could handle being in ice water for up to 15 minutes without getting hypothermia. That's not just impressive, it's practically superhuman. And no, they weren't secretly part polar bear. Here's the first thing they understood that modern science is just catching up to: panic kills you faster than cold. When you hit freezing water, your body does this thing called the cold shock response. Your heart rate shoots through the roof, you gasp uncontrollably, and your blood pressure goes crazy. Most people drown in the first minute because they panic and gasp in water. The Inuit's secret: they mastered something called the mammalian dive reflex. Yeah, that's actually what scientists call it. By staying calm and controlling their breathing, they could trigger this reflex that slows down their heart rate and reduces blood flow to their limbs. It's the same thing that lets seals stay underwater so long, and humans can actually do it too. They taught their kids this stuff from an early age. While we're teaching our kids to dog paddle in heated pools, Inuit children are learning to control their breathing when hitting cold water. Talk about extreme swimming lessons. The next big thing they figured out was what to do after getting out of the water. Most people think you should warm up as fast as possible. Wrong. The Inuit knew that rapid rewarming could actually kill you. Instead, they had this whole system. First, strip off wet clothes, yes, even in minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, then gradually rewarm using body heat and dry furs. Did you know that modern studies show that slow rewarming, like the Inuit method, increases survival rates by up to 80% compared to rapid rewarming? That's right, sometimes slower is better, even when you're freezing your butt off. They also knew something that modern survival experts still argue about: movement in cold water. While most people thrash around trying to warm up, the Inuit knew to conserve energy with minimal movement. They'd slowly turn in circles, keeping their core temperature stable while looking for the best way out. The clever part was their clothing design. They made their parkas slightly loose-fitting, not because they were going for that baggy look, but because if they fell in, they could easily slip out of wet clothes. Try doing that with your skinny jeans. Plus, their fur clothing would actually maintain some insulating properties even when wet, unlike cotton, which becomes worse than useless. They even had special tools ready just in case of falling through ice. Bone ice picks worn around the neck could help pull yourself out, and they knew exactly how to distribute their weight to prevent breaking through thin ice again. It's like they had a built-in rescue system ready at all times. Modern Arctic survival suits cost thousands of dollars and still can't match what the Inuit did with carefully prepared animal skins and some clever thinking. They basically invented the survival suit concept centuries before we started mass-producing bright orange flotation gear. The Inuit also understood the importance of helping others in cold water situations. They developed specific techniques for rescuing someone who had fallen through the ice, including human chains and special ways to approach thin ice. Their communities practiced these rescue techniques regularly, kind of like their version of a fire drill, except with way higher stakes. But perhaps it's impressive how their understanding of the body's response to cold. They knew exactly how long they could stay in freezing water before their muscles would stop working properly. They could tell by feeling alone when they needed to get out, long before their body temperature dropped to dangerous levels. That kind of body awareness is something most of us have completely lost. And you know what else they figured out? The best position to float in icy water to conserve heat. While modern survival experts took decades to determine the optimal position, the Inuit had already perfected it generations ago. They called it the seal float. And it's exactly what we now teach in cold water survival courses, but staying alive in freezing water was just one part of the challenge. Finding food when you're stuck in the middle of nowhere, that takes a whole different kind of cleverness. Next time you're standing in front of a fully stocked fridge complaining there's nothing to eat, spare a thought for the Inuit. They managed to find food in a place where most people see nothing but ice and snow. No DoorDash, no grocery stores, not even a sketchy gas station burrito in sight. The first trick they mastered was finding fish under solid ice. While modern ice fishers drill holes and hope for the best, the Inuit could literally read the ice to know exactly where fish were gathering. They looked for subtle changes in ice color and thickness that showed where fish like to hang out during winter. In fact, their success rate at ice fishing was around 80%. Compare that to modern recreational ice fishers who average about 30% on a good day. But fish were just the beginning. The Inuit understood that food wasn't just lying around. It was hidden in places most people wouldn't think to look. They'd dig through deep snow to find berries that had been naturally freeze-dried by the cold. These berries would last all winter and were packed with vitamins that helped prevent scurvy. Talk about nature's version of a vitamin supplement. You see, it's also impressive how they could spot edible seaweed under several feet of ice by looking for subtle differences in the ice's surface texture. Scientists recently studied this technique and found that these spots had up to 90% more seaweed than random areas. The Inuit weren't just guessing, they were using serious scientific observation, they just didn't call it that. They also mastered the art of food caching. But we're not talking about hiding a few snacks. These caches were survival masterpieces. They would bury whole seals in precisely chosen spots where the permafrost would keep them perfectly preserved. The really clever part, they marked these spots in ways that only other Inuit could recognize. It was like a prehistoric version of a password-protected food bank. One of their most impressive tricks was turning what most people would consider scraps into full meals. Bones weren't just waste, they were ingredients. They'd crack them open to get at the marrow, which is basically nature's butter. It's so nutrient-dense that just 1 pound of marrow has enough calories to keep you going for a full day. The Inuit were also masters at using every single part of their food sources. Modern American households waste about 30% of their food. The Inuit, their food waste was basically zero. Even the stuff most people would throw away, like animal skin and organs, became essential food sources packed with nutrients that were hard to find in the Arctic. In fact, they could even find food in animal stomachs. Gross, right? But check this out. The partially digested contents of caribou stomachs were actually full of vitamins and pre-digested plants that were otherwise impossible to get in the Arctic winter. It was like a ready-made superfood smoothie, just maybe not one you'd want to post on Instagram. They also knew exactly when and where different food sources would be available. They tracked animal migration patterns so accurately that they could predict within a few days when certain species would show up in specific areas. Modern wildlife biologists with GPS trackers and satellite data are only slightly more accurate. They could also tell if an area had recently had animals feeding there just by looking at the patterns in the snow. Small depressions or changes in the snow's surface meant food was likely nearby. It's like they could read a story written in snow that told them exactly where dinner was hiding. And you'd better believe they passed these skills down effectively. Their survival depended on it. Kids would learn from an early age how to spot these subtle signs. While modern parents are teaching their kids how to order from a menu, Inuit children are learning to read the landscape like a grocery store map. It's also fascinating how they understand seasonal food availability. They didn't just know where to find food, they knew exactly when different foods would be at their most nutritious. They could tell you the perfect time to hunt seals for the highest fat content or when certain fish would be running at their peak numbers. Even more impressive was their knowledge of emergency food sources. When regular food was scarce, they knew exactly which types of lichens were edible, which tree bark could be eaten, and even how to find tiny shrimp-like creatures in seemingly lifeless waters. Modern survival experts are still discovering some of the food sources the Inuit knew about generations ago. The Inuit also understood something that modern nutritionists have only recently confirmed: the importance of eating a variety of animal parts, not just the meat. They knew that eating things like the liver, brain, and other organs wasn't just about survival, it was about getting a complete range of nutrients that kept them healthy in one of the world's harshest environments. Speaking of staying alive, you won't believe what they wore to handle temperatures that would freeze most people solid. Ever tried to dress for minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit? The Inuit had that figured out too. Remember complaining about your winter jacket not keeping you warm enough at 32 degrees Fahrenheit? The Inuit would probably laugh while stripping down to cool off at that temperature. They created clothing so effective it could handle temperatures that would freeze your smartphone into a useless brick. The secret wasn't just piling on layers until you looked like a walking marshmallow. The Inuit created a sophisticated clothing system that modern companies are still trying to copy. They use caribou fur in a way that's basically impossible to replicate with synthetic materials. The hollow hairs trapped air like millions of tiny thermoses. But tests on traditional Inuit clothing showed it had an insulation value nearly twice that of modern Arctic gear. A typical modern Arctic parka has an insulation value of about 8 CLO. That's how scientists measure warmth. Traditional Inuit clothing, a whopping 14 CLO. In regular terms, that's the difference between shivering and sweating at negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The really brilliant part was which way they oriented the fur. The inner layer had fur facing toward the skin, while the outer layer had fur facing out. This double layer system created a microclimate around the body that stayed warm even in the harshest conditions. Modern companies have spent millions trying to create synthetic fabrics that do the same thing. But it gets interesting when they know thick socks are actually dangerous. While we're all doubling up on wool socks, the Inuit wore thin layers with room for air. Tight, thick socks? That's a one-way ticket to Frostbite City. The airspace around your feet turns out to be more important than the thickness of what's covering them. Their boots were another masterpiece of engineering. Called kamiks, they were made with different types of seal skin for different conditions. The bottom might be a bearded seal super tough, the upper part ringed seal waterproof, and the insulation made from fluffy seal fur. It's like they invented the all-terrain vehicle of footwear. Want to hear something crazy? They developed a way to make waterproof seams centuries before Gore-Tex was invented. Using sinew thread and specific stitching patterns, they created seams that would actually swell up and seal tighter when they got wet. Tests show these seams were more waterproof than modern machine-stitched seams. The mittens they designed were another stroke of genius. Instead of the fingers-together style we use today, they created a thumb-plus-finger pocket design that maximized warmth while maintaining enough dexterity to handle tools. And they included a drawstring at the wrist that could be loosened to dump heat quickly if you started sweating. Basically, an ancient version of pit zips. Their parkas had a special shape that created a warm air trap around the body. When you bent over, the warm air wouldn't all rush out. It stayed trapped in the clothing system. They also made their hoods with a sun visor built from caribou antler that was basically see-through. Talk about prescription sunglasses before they were cool. They even had special ceremonial clothing that could handle the cold while looking fancy. Imagine going to a party at negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, wearing clothes decorated with intricate beadwork and embroidery, and still staying toasty warm. Meanwhile, we can barely handle waiting for an Uber in our winter party clothes. All their clothing was modular. Pieces could be mixed and matched depending on conditions, and parts could be easily replaced if they wore out. Does your expensive winter jacket let you just swap out the worn bits? I didn't think so. Their clothing was so well designed that modern spacesuits use some of the same principles. The multi-layer system, the air gaps for insulation, even the way they managed moisture. NASA studied all of this when designing suits for astronauts. That's right, Inuit clothing technology made it to space. And get this, they even had summer versions of everything. Just like we have different clothes for different seasons, they had lighter versions of their gear for warmer weather. But unlike us dropping hundreds on new wardrobes every season, they just modified their existing pieces. Modern fashion industry, take notes. The attention to detail was incredible. Even the thread they used was chosen for specific properties. Caribou sinew would actually shrink when wet, pulling seams tighter, while whale sinew remained stable. They were material scientists before that was even a thing. And every piece of clothing was tailored to the individual wearer. No one-size-fits-all philosophy here. They knew that proper fit was crucial for the clothing system to work effectively, but all these amazing clothes wouldn't help much if you didn't have shelter. Speaking of which, you're about to learn why an igloo is way more than just a pile of snow blocks. A well-built igloo can be warmer inside than some modern apartments. The temperature difference between inside and outside can hit 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Meaning it could be negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside while you're chilling at a cozy 20 degrees Fahrenheit inside. No furnace required. The science behind igloos would make an engineer jealous. That spiral shape isn't just for looks, it's actually a crucial part of the design. Each block is cut at a specific angle and placed in a way that makes the whole structure stronger. When it's done right, an igloo can support the weight of a full-grown polar bear walking on top. Try that with your garden shed. A properly built igloo can take just 2 hours to construct and last for weeks. Meanwhile, I spent 3 days trying to build an IKEA bookshelf, and it still wobbles. The Inuit could build these survival shelters faster than most of us can pitch a modern tent. The real genius is in the entrance tunnel. Ever notice how it dips down before going up into the main space? That's not poor planning, it's brilliant engineering. Cold air sinks, so that dip creates a cold air trap, keeping the warm air inside where you want it. It's like having a thermal security guard at your front door. But the clever part about Igloo temperature control, body heat does most of the work. Just a few people inside can raise the temperature by 40 degrees. The snow blocks are actually full of tiny air pockets that trap heat while letting just enough moisture escape to prevent dripping. Modern houses with their vapor barriers and insulation are just catching up to what the Inuit figured out centuries ago. The inside of an igloo actually gets stronger as you use it. Your body heat melts a microscopic layer of snow on the inside surface, which then refreezes into ice, creating an even stronger structure. It's like the building repairs itself while you sleep. And forget about that single-room igloo you've seen in cartoons. The Inuit would sometimes build connected igloos for extended families, with different rooms for different purposes. They basically invented the open concept floor plan, Arctic style. Some winter settlements had igloos connected by tunnels, creating entire snow villages that would put modern subdivisions to shame. The sleeping area, always built on a raised platform. Not because they were fancy, but because warm air rises. They'd create a small ledge several feet off the ground where everyone would sleep, staying toasty while the cold air pooled at floor level. That's some serious temperature control knowledge right there. Tests have shown that the air circulation in a traditional igloo is almost perfect for human comfort. The curved walls create a natural convection current that keeps fresh air moving without creating drafts. Modern architects still struggle to get this kind of air circulation in buildings with million-dollar HVAC systems. They even figured out windows before glass was available. By cutting thin slices of ice and fitting them into the walls, they could let in light while keeping the heat in. Some would use freshwater ice, which is clearer than sea ice, creating windows that were almost as transparent as glass. And unlike glass, if your window broke, you could just cut a new one from the nearest frozen lake. No two igloos were exactly alike. Each one was customized to the location, weather conditions, and number of people who would use it. It's like having a custom-built house, except this one you could make in a couple of hours with just a snow knife and some know-how. Scientists studying igloo design discovered something remarkable. The curved shape of the dome creates air currents that perfectly distribute heat. The warmest air rises to the top, then flows down the curved walls, creating a constant, comfortable circulation. It's like having central air, but powered by physics instead of electricity. Even the size of snow blocks wasn't random. The Inuit knew exactly how big to make each block based on the overall size of the igloo and weather conditions. Bigger blocks for larger igloos, smaller ones for temporary shelters. Each block was cut at a precise angle to create that perfect dome shape. Modern architects use computer programs to calculate these angles. The Inuit did it by eye. They could build these structures in virtually any snow condition. Whether the snow was soft and powdery or hard and compact, they knew exactly how to modify their technique to make it work. That's like being able to build a house out of whatever materials happen to be lying around. But living in an igloo brings up another challenge: staying hydrated when everything around you is frozen solid. Let's bust a survival myth right now. Drinking your own pee is a terrible idea, despite what some TV survival experts might tell you. The Inuit knew this long before modern science confirmed it. Urine just dehydrates you faster. They had much better tricks for staying hydrated in a frozen wasteland. First up, never eat snow directly. The Inuit figured out that chomping on snow actually makes you colder and uses up precious body energy. It takes your body about 79 calories of energy just to melt and warm up 1 pound of snow to body temperature. That's like doing 20 jumping jacks just to get 1 sip of water. Instead, they developed this brilliant technique called snow tea. They'd take snow and slowly melt it using body heat or their seal oil lamps, then drink it while it was just barely above freezing. The slow melting process meant their bodies didn't waste energy warming up the water. Modern survival experts now recommend this exact same method. The Inuit could get up to 20% of their daily water needs just from eating properly prepared frozen meat. When you freeze meat correctly, the water content stays locked in the tissue. As they'd eat it, their body heat would slowly melt this frozen water, giving them a steady supply of hydration without having to melt snow. They also knew something that modern athletes are just figuring out: You need salt with your water. While we're buying expensive electrolyte drinks, the Inuit would drink small amounts of seal blood with their water. Gross? Maybe. But it worked better than any sports drink you can buy. The blood contained the perfect balance of electrolytes their bodies needed. They'd sometimes carry water in sealed sections of the sealed intestine, nature's water bottle. These wouldn't freeze solid because of the salt content in the tissue, and body heat would keep them just liquid enough to drink from. Meanwhile, we're here paying $30 for special winter water bottles. The really impressive part was how they managed water during long hunting trips. They developed a technique for creating ice caches along common travel routes. They'd build small snow shelters over pools of water, which would freeze in a way that made them easy to break apart and melt later. It was like having water fountains spread across the Arctic. Modern campers often carry those fancy water filtration systems, but the Inuit had their own purification method. They knew exactly which ice was safe to melt for drinking. Clear, black ice? Good to go. Cloudy, white ice could be risky. They could read ice quality better than some of us can read nutrition labels. The average person needs about a gallon of water per day in the Arctic because the dry, cold air dehydrates you faster than desert conditions. The Inuit managed to get this much water in temperatures where modern water bottles freeze solid in minutes. Their techniques were so effective that cases of dehydration were actually pretty rare. They even had special tools just for water management. Small ivory picks could break up ice without wasting energy, and they carved special spoons that wouldn't conduct heat away from hot drinks too quickly. These tools were so well designed that some Arctic explorers still prefer traditional Inuit water tools over modern equipment. They understood that staying hydrated wasn't just about drinking water, it was about not losing it in the first place. Their clothing was designed to minimize sweating, their shelters were built to capture snow that could be melted, and they even knew how to breathe in a way that minimized moisture loss through respiration. Another technique they developed was using specific types of seaweed as a water source. When properly prepared, certain seaweeds could provide both water and essential minerals. It's like they had access to natural vitamin water centuries before it became a trendy drink. They also mastered the art of timing their water intake. Instead of drinking large amounts at once, they'd take small, frequent sips throughout the day. This prevented their bodies from wasting water and kept them from sweating, which could be deadly in extreme cold. Modern Arctic expeditions now follow this same principle. What's really interesting is how they taught these hydration skills to their children. They'd make games out of identifying good ice sources and properly melting snow. While our kids were playing video games, Inuit children were learning life-saving water management skills and having fun doing it. Kids would compete to see who could spot the best ice for drinking water or who could melt snow the most efficiently without wasting fuel. But keeping your body hydrated was only half the battle. Your mind needs to stay sharp too. And that's where the power of storytelling came in. But these weren't your average bedtime stories. The Inuit went months in the dark Arctic winter with nothing but stories to keep them entertained. And these weren't just random tales to pass the time. Their stories were basically survival guides wrapped in entertainment. Kind of like TikTok survival tips, but actually useful. Take the story of the Kalupiluit, these creepy creatures that supposedly grabbed kids who wandered onto thin ice. Parents today tell their kids not to talk to strangers. Inuit parents told stories about monsters that dragged careless children into freezing waters. Guess which warning worked better? Kids stayed away from dangerous ice, and they remembered exactly why. Studies of Inuit storytelling show that people remember survival information 70% better when it's wrapped in a story versus straight instructions. That's because our brains are wired to remember narratives better than lists of facts. The Inuit figured this out centuries before modern science did. They didn't just tell scary stories, though. Some tales were absolutely hilarious, featuring clumsy hunters making rookie mistakes or animals outsmarting overconfident people. These funny stories stuck in your head, and suddenly you'd remember not to make the same dumb mistakes when you were out hunting. It's like learning from someone else's embarrassing moments without having to experience them yourself. These stories changed with the seasons. Winter tales were longer and more detailed, perfect for those endless dark nights when everyone was stuck inside. Summer stories were shorter and more action-packed, ideal for quick breaks between hunting and gathering. The Inuit basically invented seasonal programming before Netflix. The best stories included precise details about survival skills, how to read weather patterns, where to find food, which ice formations were dangerous. But instead of boring lectures, these details were buried in exciting tales about heroes and adventures. Modern teachers would kill for this kind of engagement rate. But what makes it truly brilliant is these stories worked as a communal survival database. Each generation added their own experiences and observations, updating the stories to keep them relevant. While we're busy updating our phones, they are updating their collective knowledge through storytelling. And you know what's really amazing? Many of these stories are still perfectly accurate today. When scientists study Arctic weather patterns or animal behavior, they often find that ancient Inuit stories already documented these phenomena. Those myths about how seals behave under ice, modern research with underwater cameras proved them 100% correct. These skills and stories help the Inuit not just survive, but thrive in one of Earth's harshest environments. They turned an icy wasteland into a home, and did it with more style than most of us show on a good day.